The sound of falling engines awakened me before dawn. They howled and clattered and thumped, and for a moment I thought that I might be in danger. However, the wailing soon passed by, and then came the explosion. Mama ran into my room, her long brown hair as wild as her expression. "Joelle," she cried, "Joelle." "I'm fine, Mama." "It has crashed," she added. "Did you hear?" I sat up in bed, nodding and shivering. It was late November and uncommonly cold, much like the previous winter had been. My bedroom window was ill-fitting, iced over and drafty, and my nose ran. The climate matched the mood of my country, overrun by Germans and without hope of liberty. France in 1941 was a shadow of itself, shivering under oppressive forces. "Will they come here?" I asked, talking of the Germans. "It is probable," Mama told me. "Those dogs will do as they please." She spat out her words, her contempt for our conquerors obvious. Everyone hated them, bar those who collaborated. They were the enemy, to be thwarted and resisted as best we could. Mama and Papa went further still, engaging with the Maquis, who would later be remembered as resistance. We sheltered them when required and helped them on their secretive missions, all of which meant danger and possibly death. For myself, then only 13 years on this earth, the concepts of oppression and mortality should have been unfamiliar things. Like far-off countries and exotic foods, they should have remained the stuff of stories. But we were under occupation and my age meant nothing. Childhood, in its purest form, was impossible. So I embraced my new life despite my fears. I did as I was asked, like a good little soldier might, and each time we frustrated the enemy, however slightly, I felt proud and worthy. Such was my life then.
Yes, that's from Mohinder's War.
That's, yeah, the narrator is Joelle, who's a sort of half French, half English girl. She discovers him when he crashes. So she narrates the story. Yeah.
Can you tell us, I think a theme of a lot of your stories, you're telling untold stories. So, you know, you're filling in the gaps really there of the Second World War.
Yeah, the idea was when I was young, I read so many World War II stories, and you know they were sort of there are loads now as well, and I love them, always have. But I got to a point where once I discovered, for example, especially World War II, the number of sort of Indian soldiers, Jamaicans, etc., Poles who were involved, whose stories weren't being told, I wanted to read more of those, and they were incredibly difficult to find. So the idea behind Mohinder's War is to write a World War II adventure story in its classic form, but with a Sikh character who originally was going to be the narrator, but I decided to change the narrator just because it made, in terms of the structure of the story, it made it a lot easier to do.
Yes, it's quite unusual for you to have a female narrator. I did think that worked very well.
Actually, you say that, but I'm one of the few male authors I know in Britain that regularly has female narrators.
Oh dear! Oh, maybe she must be. I haven't read all of your books because there's so many, but all of the ones I've read, I think apart from this one, I've had male narrators.
I sort of chop and change quite a lot. So usually it's sort of, I mean, my Barrington Stoke ones, the last two have been female narrators. Mohinder's War's female narrator. So what I tend to do is I tend to write them as I would a male narrator. They just happen to be female. It's a kind of balance. I have two daughters. So it's a balance I try to get in terms of, well, if we're going to have an adventure story, it doesn't really matter for me whether the narrator is male or female. But if I'm going to write a female narrator, I don't make any allowances. I'd write the male narrator the same way. I've actually I did an entire story where I wrote it as a male narrator. And then at the end, I just decided to make the narrator female. I didn't really change much. You know, it's about sort of showing that females and males can have the same adventures, and that's something I'm trying to do for my daughter. My oldest is 20, my little one's 7, but it's to show them that they don't have to, they can't not be characters in the story simply because they're female. You know, there's nothing stopping them doing what males do in stories.
That's interesting. I mean, right from the first one I read was Unarranged Marriage, and that was your first novel, wasn't it?
That was 20 years ago.
Yeah. So was that when I know you said you were good at school, you were good at English at school and wanted to be a writer. Was Unarranged Marriage the point where you thought, okay, now I am a writer? Or
yeah, it's a weird one. I've been chatting to a couple of authors I know who are both relatively new, and they sent me either manuscripts or sort of advanced sort of proof copies that I reviewed for them or gave them advice on. And that we were chatting about the idea that it is that point where you have your first book published and you start thinking, right, I am actually a writer. I mean, truthfully, you're a writer if you write, but as a professional published writer, yeah, that was the one. That kind of, the idea of going into Waterstones in Leicester and seeing it on the shelf. And then I went to the old Browsers, which was in Stonygate, which no longer exists, sadly, which was my most local independent. And the lady that ran it had like a massive display of them. And that's a really, it's kind of embarrassing and kind of a wonderful feeling at the same time. So yeah, you really do get in your head then, right? I've done it.
Yeah.
And then there's the fraud thing. You start thinking that, well, I've got to do another one now and then another one. So yeah, there's a balance there that I'm not sure I've ever got right, to be honest.
You got, I mean, it won awards, so you got quite a lot of attention early on.
Yeah. I mean,
you do.
Around. So after 20 years, it's still around, still selling. It's a Penguin original now. So it sits with two of the books that inspired me as a kid. So The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton and The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole by Sue Townsend, you know, two of my biggest influences. And now When Arranged Marriage sits with them in the same kind of originals imprint, which is probably my most proud moment, to be honest, as a writer.
Yeah, Sue Townsend, I mean, you've got the connections, that there's humor there and the teenage protagonists, but also that you mention your hometown, like you mention places like Oadby and Leicester, and like Sue did. Like, it's interesting, I think, for teens to see that books are set in their places. You know, adventures don't happen in other places. More, you know, not just in the capital cities. That stuff is going on in Leicester.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with Leicester and with sort of Leicester schools and Leicester sort of teenagers, when I used to talk about it, obviously they got it. But I've been to Birmingham, Nottingham, wherever, Derby, and I talk to people and say, actually, you don't have to, just because it's set in Leicester, you can imagine it being set in the communities in which you live. And it's all exactly as you say. It's about getting them to understand that they don't have to live in London. They don't have to be in New York. They don't, you know, we have drama and story goes on around us every day. And I actually think some of the best stuff we've got is written outside of places like London. I read recently Jenny Downham's latest one, and I've forgotten the name of it. It's totally passed me by. Wonderful. She's a wonderful writer, Jenny. And I don't know where she lives, but this story is actually set around the South Coast. And it's about a little young teenage girl who runs away and makes friends with an older lady who has Alzheimer's and kind of sort of sees her as her younger sister. And it's a wonderful story, but it's just set in a kind of rundown seaside town. And for me, there's a charm there in those stories. Phil Earle does it quite a lot. Anthony McGowan, you know, it's just won the Carnegie with setting a story, you know, kind of partly in some grim northern town. And that's his description, not mine, by the way. And I think those stories resonate in a different way with young people and also with adults. David Almond famously did it with the sort of Northumberland coast. You know, fantastic writing. So it's important that we see it, and we need to see more of it, for me, from Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, because the East Midlands, we're okay, but we're not as well represented, I think.
And when you think about the writers that they still champion, they talk about D.H. Lawrence and Byron, and you know, they're all dead. There's a lot. I know that's unfair. You know, there is great stuff going on in writing East Midlands and so on. But you know, when you see
writing, yeah, there's some wonderful writing. It's not about the writing not being there. It's about exposure, which takes us into the whole kind of diversity debate and all the rest of it, representation. But it is about us. I think Nottingham's probably best out of the East Midlands cities in terms of shouting about itself and promoting itself. But I still don't think we do it enough. There are some fantastic talent around the East Midlands, and it's when a lot of the newer writers, particularly, and even some of the established ones, just don't get enough exposure, and we need to do something about that. Because you know, all three of the cities are the way that our communities work it's really important that we kind of shout about that and we talk about that and we explore it. And certainly with Leicester being the most multicultural place in the whole of the UK, and the attacks on multiculturalism that we see from various members of the right wing, it's important for me, and always has been, from Unarranged Marriage, to defend that and to represent it.
Interesting the way you work with, particularly I find with masculinity, like in Unarranged Marriage and with several other books, you have intercultural friendships, like they're young Sikh lads hanging out with the black friends, with white girls, with, you know, that's, you show that teenagers are mixing across, that it truly is a multicultural community out there.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely. That was my experience growing up. So I don't know. I still see it now. I don't see it as much. I think I think some of this latest generation have become a bit more kind of inward looking. And I don't know, well, I think some of that is to do with the way, for example, young Muslim males particularly are represented by the media. So there's a tendency to be inward looking because you feel like you're under attack. But yeah, that was my experience growing up. My best friend is black and his parents are from Antigua. You know, my daughter's best friend is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white lad who lives up the road. I'm in Obi at the moment, and I've written about Obi. My daughter's boyfriend is a different race to her. This is the experience of being in any major city, but Leicester particularly. You know, we had a new postie turn up, and I was talking to my neighbour over the road. He's called Keith, ex-RAF, originally from Cornwall in his 80s. And the postie comes up and she's like, it's a bit like the United Nations around here. And I laughed and when I said, have you not been around here before? She went, no. She goes, I actually live outside Leicester. And she was shocked. She was like, you know, she lives in a little village. So she was kind of shocked at seeing all these different people. There's a lady from Nigeria with her two daughters who've rented a bungalow just 2 doors up. And they'd come out and we were having a little chat with them. It's quite I think it can be quite a shock for people. So who don't understand or live in particularly kind of multicultural communities. So it's a way of representing that. And that's been my experience with schools. You know, On Arranged Marriage, the first book award it won was the Angus Book Award in Scotland, east coast of Scotland. And I went in to a girls' school. There were no non-white pupils at all. And I went in and I said, I'm really blunt. I was like, I'm amazed that you chose this book, considering it's so far out of your experience. And one of the young women went, she said, but that's exactly why we chose it. She goes, we wanted to find out more. We were interested, and young people will do that if you present them with the right stories, the right information, and the right information that they can access. They are very, very open-minded. We have to teach them. It's a classic thing. We have to teach them prejudices. So if we choose not to teach them some prejudices, they grow up without them. You know, it's a very, very simple thing. I think a lot of people misunderstand. Children who are prejudiced have been taught that prejudice, they're not born with it.
There's so many questions I could go with there. You've published 2 with 5 leaves, and one of them, Them and Us. I mean, you talk about this it's a companion piece to What's Your Problem. Can you tell us a bit, because this is set, Them and Us is set in a village outside Nottingham.
That's, What's Your Problem? Yeah, What's Your Problem is set in a village. Them and Us is actually set in Leicester.
Right, oh, I've got them the wrong way around.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to do because they are essentially mirror images. So
I did reread them together this time, yeah.
What you've got is, with the first one, it's a classic kind of, it's an everyday story. You've got an Asian family that moved to an all-white village. The reason I chose an unnamed village on the borders of Leicester, Nottingham and Derby is because at the time I wrote it, there had been a huge increase in far-right activity just off around the M1, around Nottinghamshire and Derby on the border. I mean, the police back in those days, late 90s, early 2000s, found a cross burning, for example, in a field. The BNP decided to make it their national headquarters, that area. So there was a lot going on. And I'd watched a documentary, a Dispatches one for Channel 4, about a similar thing. A female Asian reporter, a young one, went and secretly filmed taking over a newsagent or an off license and recorded what happened, and it was horrendous, the racist sort of abuse and sort of the attacks that happened on her. So the first one was based on that, and it's kind of, even though it's an everyday thing, it's the kind of thing that's accepted as an anti-racist story. It's an exploration of racial prejudice. With Them and Us, it was about, I went into my old school in Leicester and I'm talking to a group of lads who are all in trouble, and there's one young white lad in a room full of Asian lads. And I started talking to him and I said, you know, I want you to write about your own experiences, and he refused. And when I asked him why, we actually left the room with his teacher. He said, he goes, some of those lads in there pick on me because I'm white. And he said that there aren't many white lads in my year. He goes, there's like 3. He goes, so I get picked on. And I was interested in that as a kind of reverse look at racism. And I think a lot of people are very reticent to look at that kind of reverse racism. Whereas I'm not bothered by any of that. If I see something that I want to explore, I don't worry about what other people might think of it. I'll just go and explore it. And it's interesting that Them and Us didn't get anywhere near the same reception as What's Your Problem did. What's Your Problem got great reviews, really well reviewed, really sort of popular, and Them and Us not even close. You know, it was almost like it didn't exist, which is interesting for me. From a family, as I come from a family where when I was growing up, probably half of them, probably more, 3/4, had racial prejudices, had cultural prejudices. They were homophobic, sexist, misogynistic, and that honesty about racism outside of the white community, it just doesn't exist. I still don't think it exists today. I'm not going to apologize for saying that. We're not exploring. We talk about racial prejudice and how it affects BAME communities. We're not exploring enough how the racial prejudice and kind of the other prejudices within the BAME communities, separate ones, directly affect the way they interact with people in the wider white British community. And I think if we're going to have this debate, we've got to do both sides. Not a popular opinion, though.
No. Well, you know, there are unpopular opinions out there.
Yeah.
And it mystifies me that the Irish can complain about immigration when we have emigrated all over the world.
Yeah. No,
there's some balance missing there.
It's definitely. I mean, I hear Australians complaining about immigration. I have brown Australian cousins, who one of them is a politician in New South Wales, okay, in an area called Coffs Harbour, and he is a politician for a openly anti-immigrant party. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, there's a story. Yeah.
I want to go out. I've been out there once. I want to go out again, mostly to take my little girl, but also I want to write a story set out there. That would be probably take a lot of money. So I'm going to have to find a publisher that's got some. But yeah.
You like tackling the difficult issues, don't you? I mean, your degree was in politics, am I right?
Yeah.
As I would say, there's a strand of politics in all of your work, all of the ones I've read, certainly, that you're looking at social politics.
I'm kind of, I've always been sort of interested in politics as a, if we sort of look at politics in terms of Westminster government, all the rest of it, and the science of it, I've always been interested in that, and also the theories. But yeah, every day the social politics of Britain is something that I've grown less interested in, the kind of government side of it, the science and the theory, and I'm much more interested in the way it works in everyday lives. So politics with a little p rather than a big P. But yeah, I've always been political. I have very strong opinions. I have sort of very strong views about the way things are going in society. And I think for me as a writer, that's been one of my biggest influences. It's been one of my biggest sort of motivations, is to explore some of those ideas, some of those thoughts, some of those sort of feelings that I get wandering around a city like Leicester, because I've never left Leicester. I was in London for 5 years. I came back. I lived just outside Leicester in what is now, we now call the plague zone, because obviously we're still, quarantined. Yeah, so it's always there. The politics is always going to be there. I don't think I could write a story unless I'm writing a really young kid story. I'm working on some ideas for really, younger stories. But even then, one of those kind of series is about artifacts that are in British museums being taken by children back to where they actually belong. So there's a strand there. It's just in a simpler way. But yeah, politically, I wouldn't say I'm as active now as I used to be. I've grown quite apathetic with the politics with a big P. But politics with a little p, the everyday stuff, I think that's where a lot of great stories lie and still lie. I think there are loads to be told.
Writing is a kind of activism in itself when you're tackling those big questions. The way you model masculinity in your books is very interesting, that you're challenging the kind of, that drinking and beating up people is a way to be a man. Yeah. Are you conscious of that, of modeling more interesting?
Absolutely. It was, again, from day one, I wanted to be unapologetic about that type of masculinity existing. So I did early on, I did get people saying, you know, do you really need to show it this way? And I went, well, yeah, I want my characters to be honest. So I want their portrayals to be honest, and I want to be honest about the way that I grew up within the family and the cultural background that I did, and not just the Punjabi, British, Indian and British, but also, and Sikhism as a religion as an aside, but not just the Punjabi, British cultural thing, because there were men and teenage males from the Caribbean or Caribbean descent around me who were brought up with similar ideas about women, for example. Most of the younger white people I grew up around and their families around Highfields and North Evington and sort of that area in Leicester were either of Irish descent or they were Eastern European. So what we used to call the former Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania. So there was a whole load of us in this community, and lots of the young British, English white people as well. There were always attitudes, and we're talking about a time when things like Page 3 in the Sun was just a regular thing every day. You know, 3/4 of the men we knew, the adult men, would be reading the Sun. You know, lots of sexist stuff on the telly, misogynistic, racism being kind of rampant. And within that sort of toxic masculinity was a part of my everyday life. I mean, I remember being told by an uncle who saw me washing the dishes when I was about 9, 10 years old. He said, "What are you doing?" And smacked me on the back of the head. And I said, "What?" He said, "What's your sister for?" He said, "If you start washing the dishes, your sister will start thinking that will start getting ideas above the station," essentially is what he was saying. You know, she'll start thinking that she has the right to go and do this, this, and this. That's what women do. And I had to teach myself. I had to basically re-educate myself to get rid of a lot of that, which is why my characters often struggle with it, but then find a way out. And it's usually books. I don't know if you've noticed, my characters all tend to read. And it was reading that did that. Same with homophobia. You know, I spent years with homophobic attitudes as a youngster, and then became a young teen and into my kind of mid-teens, and you start to lose it. One, because I had a friend who was openly gay, or made friends with somebody who was openly gay, male gay, and also because I'm looking at race and I'm looking at cultural discrimination and prejudice, and I'm raging against it. But within me, there was this prejudice towards people that I knew was there. And I thought, well, how can I complain and rage against this side of it if I'm not raging against what exists in myself? So it was, you know, that process has always been there. It's you know, and it's an ongoing process. You know, you find yourself sometimes drawn back with certain attitudes. I think that if we're honest, we all sometimes get, and you stop yourself and you go, no, hang on a minute, you know, what am I doing here? How am I thinking? Is my thought process fair? So yeah, I've always been very honest about that, and it's important to me. I did it with Killing Honor as well, quite a lot with Killing Honor, I think. But yeah, I want to keep exploring that. I think it's more toxic now with this latest generation than it has been for a while, mostly because of social media and young people wanting to, the phrase, I guess, is big themselves up on social media, and it's causing lots of tension within communities and lots of violence. Once these people come off social media and meet on the streets, we've had several examples in Leicester over the last few years of young men being beaten up, stabbed, murdered because of a argument or a perceived insult that's happened online. And I'm sure it's the same in Derby, Nottingham, Birmingham, wherever. So
bullying online has just got out of hand. I mean, in so many ways, I'm so glad not to be a teenager now, because I think it's very tough for them trying to handle that.
Yeah.
But you work a lot in libraries, going out into schools. So what's lockdown been like for you when all that kind of community work has stopped?
It's well, financially, obviously, it's had a massive impact. I've probably lost 75% of my income this year already. So, but outside of that, emotionally, mentally, in terms of work, it's been a nightmare. I mean, it's a real struggle. I'm used to, and I'm very kind of, as you can probably tell, I'm very mouthy. I've got lots of very strong opinions. I talk a lot. I'm very social most of the time. I can be quite quiet, but I love being out and working in schools with pupils. It's like one of my great passions, and has been since I started. And so being stuck at home, not being on the road, has been really difficult. And my little one, who's 7, is the same as me. She's very sociable, you know, hasn't been at school, and it's affected her. So it's not, I'm not going to, you know, lie to you. I'm not going to pretend that it's been easy. It's not. It's been really difficult, and I'm really missing being out and working in schools. Like I said, it's a huge part of what I do. It's for me, it's as important as being a writer, and they're linked, but they're also separate. So yeah, it's been tough.
Yeah, but I can tell because I've interviewed you live that it energizes you being out there talking to people. And I mean, I love that as well, that when you work with books, there are good aspects about having to be at home and just sitting there. But like, you know, you miss the community of writers.
Yeah, and just going out speaking to teachers and librarians, a large part of my understanding of what's going on within the education system, in terms of reading for pleasure and the difficulties we have, and the you know, things like the sort of reading ages not being as high as they are in year 7, for example, which is one thing I've understood for 15 odd years, because I'm going in speaking to teachers and librarians and booksellers and people who are on the, you know, right on the front line when it comes to dealing with literacy. And we have a literacy, we have a major literacy problem in the UK. I don't care what anybody says. When you've got year 7s coming in and their average reading age isn't sort of 13, 14, which is what it should be for them to access the curriculum in its entirety from year 7, we've got a major issue. And I don't think politics with a big P is not paying enough attention to that. Whereas I'm going in talking to librarians and teachers and booksellers and literacy coordinators, etc., and they're all telling me the same thing. They're telling me, and that's really good to know. One, it informs my writing and how I think about writing and where I place my talks when I go and talk about reading for pleasure. It's very, very helpful. But also, they're genuinely very interesting people as well. And it's kind of, you miss that as well. You miss the conversations. You miss going out and having a chat about the latest book that somebody's read, because it's not the same. I've spoken to a few people via Zoom, you know, on the phone, etc., you know, messaging, but it's not the same.
Used to say, where do your stories come from? You know, the fact that them and us comes from having a chat in the classroom with the boy that's dealing with us.
Yeah.
That's, you know, what other writers are you inspired by? I mean, you mentioned Sue Townsend, and the other writer that you can send us a link of who it was, that the book you mentioned earlier.
It's The Outsiders by Essie Hinton.
All right, okay.
She was 17 when she wrote that. You know, it's blue collar American, US white kids, blue collar America, exploring what's going on. So very different to my experience of growing up, but beyond the race, culture, country, cultural differences, you know, national differences. It was the emotion and the drama that connects, and the pressures of everyday life that connected. But yeah, I mentioned David Almond. Well, early on, I got given quite a lot of books by him. David, he's a fantastic writer. I'm inspired by, you know, lots of different people. Mallory Blackman, you know, just don't tell her, she'll get a big head. No, I'm kidding. But Mallory has been very supportive of me from the moment I started. So there are loads. I mean, even somebody like Jacqueline Wilson, it sounds very, very odd, but I think Jacqueline Wilson was a pioneer, and I think people forget that about her. She took, and I've said this for years, she made reading stories about non-nuclear families a norm. When I was growing up, it wasn't. If you were in a non-nuclear family, it was an issue story that you were in. And yes, she writes about issues, but she just makes it every day, and it's like a regular thing. And I think that's really important, because we're talking about a large percentage of young people in the UK not being represented because they're not in this, you know, model, fictionalized, idealized nuclear family situation. My kids aren't. So it's about representing that. I love Michael Morpurgo's work in a different way. But I'm inspired across the board. I read a lot of crime novels, so I haven't quite got around to writing an adult crime novel yet, but I may well do at some point. But yeah, you know, Khaled Hosseini, I remember when I read The Kite Runner was great, but when I read 1,000 Splendid Suns, you know, and this is as a writer, I'm already a writer, and I read 1,000 Splendid Suns, and it kind of blows you away, the writing and sort of the way he structures it. And so every day when I'm reading, or every other day when I'm reading, at some point there's going to be a writer or a passage by a writer that inspires me. And I don't think that's ever going to change. You know, even as a professional writer myself, I'm never going to say that I'm not blown away by the writing of my peers. It's, there are some fantastic writers out there. I mentioned Phil Earle earlier, his Being Billy, which came out quite a while after Unarranged Marriage. I remember reading that and going, wow. A guy called Malachy Doyle, who's Irish, wrote a book called Georgie, which I still remember to this day. It's quite weird how that works. Yeah. I just read recently. I read The Velvet Fox, Catherine. It's on my shelf somewhere in the living room. But The Velvet Fox, again, story I would never pick up. I got sent it because I was judging the Costa Book Award. First the children's side, and then I was an actual judge for the main panel. So I got 50, 60 books, and it's the kind of book I would never pick up. I wouldn't even think about it. It's just sitting there, and I started reading it, and I got it, and I've now put it away, because as soon as my little girl is ready to read that story, I'm going to read it to her, because it's such a fantastic story. So it's the power of books. It's there's always a brilliant book around the corner.
Do you think children and teens fiction is getting more serious recognition these days, or do you think there's still slightly snobby attitude about it?
I think there's two sides to this now. We've got young adult, which is predominantly read by adults. So it doesn't really, although it's ostensibly about British teenagers, the British stuff, it's not. It's basically being read by adults. It's being promoted by adults. If you go to the YA conventions and all the rest of it, it's essentially adults. So, and then you've got what is now laughably called middle grade. We've taken on these ridiculous American terms to talk about British schools, which is ridiculous, and reading ages. So middle grade, which we used to call junior fiction. We don't have grades in this country at all anywhere. So what we've got is this junior fiction has exploded as middle grade. We've got YA, and in the middle, we've got British teenagers, and they're not really being written about. I had a conversation with my editor, the senior editor for fiction. I won't say which one because she'll be easily recognised, but at one of the biggest publishers anywhere in the world, and in the UK. And we were talking about this, the idea that the teen stuff that I started writing with Unarranged Marriage, The Crew, etc., has gone missing. It's there, but it's not as prevalent as something like YA. So YA is getting coverage. It's getting lots of kind of exposure. Middle grade is doing that, but the stuff in the middle that we need, that schools are desperately shouting for because it's not there, doesn't seem to be getting that same sort of attention. And that's quite a weird thing, but we know YA is an issue anyway at the moment. The YA sales fell for a few years. I guess they would have picked up at the moment. All book sales hopefully have picked up over the lockdown because people are reading more, potentially. We don't know for sure. We'll find out very soon, I guess. But yeah, the review space has disappeared. National newspapers are no longer reviewing. We don't have a national or a televised book show that talks about children's, teenage and young adult books, and there's no reason why we couldn't have that. So I think it's, in one sense, it's not as good on a national level, on a kind of, in terms of exposure, it's nowhere near as good as it was when I started 20 years ago. But in terms of social media and online, I think it's grown massively. It's grown exponentially since I started, obviously. But we're seeing more and more of it. My only kind of query about that is the reach that a lot of the online blogging has. I love online bloggers. I've had to, Mohinder's went on a blog tour. I love doing that stuff, but I'm not sure how much of that, what kind of reach people have, because they're within an echo chamber, really, of other people who are interested in books and literature. I don't know. I don't think it's getting out to the wider public, and that's a problem.
I see we've run out of time. Can I ask you one question before we leave it? Because I feel I could stay here all day. What are you most proud of in your writing career?
I said earlier the idea that Unarranged Marriage sits with The Outsiders and The Secret Divergent Mold. I mean, that's massive for me. That's kind of, those are the two books that made me want to be a writer. Sue Townsend was my hero, my role model, my hero. I ended up becoming friends with her. So for that to sit on the shelves in the same little imprint, umbrella imprint, as originals is fantastic. I got given a doctorate by DMU, which was a real shock. It was a massive shock that they wanted to do it. But, I'm quite proud of that. But I think the idea that I'm still here after 20 years, a friend of mine did a study on diversity within publishing. This has been happening loads, but she did a study on the different authors from different backgrounds and how well represented they are or not. And it turns out that, and this is with Roehampton, the Roehampton Institute, it turns out that British-born South Asian male writers, so people from my kind of particular sort of community, are the least well represented. We're the rarest in Britain. So, because I can name, there's me, Irfan Master, who's also from Leicester, Nikesh Shukla, who's a relatively, you know, late comer, late edition, but there are very few who's around. So the fact that I'm still around after 20 years, I think is quite, for me, is quite a proud achievement, because there are, in the last 10 years particularly, there have been any number of points where I've just thought, you know what, stuff this, I can't be bothered. I'll go and do something where I don't have to worry about the color of my skin affecting how I'm promoted or what I get to write. You know, I don't want that to be an issue, but it's a fight. It's been a struggle, and I'm kind of, I guess that's the thing I'm most proud about, is the fact that I've had moments where I've just wanted to give up and walk away, and I haven't. And that's kind of, that's a willfulness inside me that I didn't know I had. Because in the past, I would have just walked away. I would have just gone, no, I'll go and do something else. So I've kind of stuck with it. And the fact that I'm still around after 20 years, I feel like that's quite a big thing. Certainly speaking to other authors. And again, I mentioned Mallory. Mallory said this would be something that, a stage I would get to. She told me this as a bit of advice when I first started. But she's been indispensable in terms of helping me understand how the industry works, and how I'd get annoyed at being invited on panels to talk about diversity, but never onto a panel to talk about what my favorite science fiction book is, or, you know, we're not treated the same way. So yeah, but mostly it's just seeing my book sit next to The Outsiders and Secret Diary of Adrian Mole. That's just huge for me. It's kind of, you know, it's kind of thing you dream about when you're a kid. When I was a kid, I used to dream about having my book next to Sue Townsend's book. You know, you just kind of go, where's my hero? There's my role model. I've written a book, and it sits there, and that kind of does. So yeah, that's just, you know, unbelievable for me. I'm not really interested in accolades. It's great to win them. It's great to win awards. It's a real sign that young people are reading the books, because I only ever win awards that are voted for by young people, actually voted for by readers. So, and that's a massive thing. I love all of that. I've got to be honest, I love the festival scene, you know, being kind of taken somewhere and you get sort of, you know, you get put up in accommodation, all the hay and all the rest of that nonsense when it runs. That's all great. But no, mostly it's that, but also my work in schools and the impact that has, and the feedback I get from young people. I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of the impact, the feedback I get from teachers and librarians about the work I do. So yeah, you know, a few things, but I try not to be overly prideful. I made a commitment to try and live without ego, based on something my granddad taught me. My granddad was a very devout Sikh, and this idea that once you allow ego into your thought processes are kind of, they're skewed. So it's something that I think it's a battle every day, but it's something that I try to do. So when I'm working with kids and they're enjoying what I'm doing, I don't sit there thinking, oh, I'm wonderful. I just think, wow, these kids are really enjoying it and they're getting something from it, and that makes me very happy. So yeah, and I'm very proud of the fact that they get something from what I do with them. So yeah.
Telling the untold stories. In Now or Never, a Dunkirk story, you're going to leave us with a reading from that?
Yes, I'm going to read the prologue, just to give you an idea of this character's voice. He's called Fazal Khan, and he's going to run away to join the army. It was still dark when I left my village, carrying only what I needed to travel. My family were fast asleep and I didn't wake them. I was running away, desperate to find my fortune, desperate to follow in my grandfather's footsteps. My decision was swift, but the planning had taken months. Now I was finally ready to leave, and though my heart ached at the thought of my mother's distress and the tears of my younger sisters, I did not waver. My grandfather had taught me to believe in myself, to be sure of my actions. Now that I was going and he was no longer with me, I wondered what he might think, whether he was looking down on me as I sneaked away. I stopped a mile from the village, which would soon be consumed by the city of Rawalpindi. and become another of its many districts. I stood by a grove of trees under which my grandfather, my Baba, had often sat. There, he would take shade from the sun, chatting with his friend Mr. Singh, playing cards. There, he taught me many lessons about life and told stories of his time in Europe, fighting in what they had called the Great War. Now, as I stood and thought of him a while, I was leaving to have my own adventures, hoping to follow Baba's example and become a man. I had no idea what awaited me, and I'll admit some fear. Mostly, however, I was excited. Baba had no gravestone to mark his passing. Instead, I touched his favourite wooden seat under his favourite tree and asked for his blessing. And then, without another rearward glance, I set off on my journey. It's a very simple story. It's about a kid who runs away because he kind of wants to join the war effort, following his grandfather's footsteps, and very quickly realizes that it's not about glory and all the rest of it. So again, it's another war story, much like Mohinder's War, like the ones I used to read, but with, in this case, a brown Muslim, modern day Pakistan, as was in India then, born and raised protagonist, narrator, who tells the story. And again, this story is based firmly in reality. These stories existed. Company 32 of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps, their story's just never been told, which was a major shock, but also a huge honour to be able to write. So,
and there were parts of that story made me cry, like what happened at Dunkirk, that they were almost left behind after all that war effort.
And you talk about British heroes, and these people are held up, white British protagonists in the Great War and World War II were held up as, you know, and then you look at somebody like Captain John Ashdown, who led the Company 32, and people don't even know his name. I mean, his own son, Paddy Ashdown, who was way more famous than his father ever became, was reticent about talking about him. And I kind of understand why. Having spoken to his brother Mark, who was incredibly helpful with the book, I sort of understand why. But these are the kind of people we need to be talking about. Captain John Ashdown, born in India, raised in India, fluent in Urdu, Punjabi, Pashto, you know, felt more Indian than he ever did English. But a true British hero, a true war hero. There's no statue to him. There's no commemoration of his sacrifice and what he did. You know, it's scary, and there are hundreds of these stories. There are thousands probably, you know, from across Europe, from across the British Isles, including Ireland, from Poland, from, you know, you name it. These stories are there. The roles of women and the role women played, and certainly non-white females or more sort of working class white females within British society. These stories are there, and I think it's time we started representing them more clearly, which is why the untold stories thing is always going to be what I do. You know, even in its most basic form as basic children's storytelling without the major politics, it's still going to be untold voices, unheard voices, you know, diverse characters, because that's what I began doing, and I'm not going to stop doing that regardless of what I write.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Bali Rai. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
It's been a great pleasure to talk to you too. Thank you very much. Real honour.